And welcome in. Here he is, Mr. Paul Hynek. Uh, Privileged enough for him to be the guest here today on UAP on the Unidentified Alien Podcast. Paul, thanks so much for joining here today.
My pleasure, Stephen. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into, I guess, the obvious, right, about your father, the great Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and also the current landscape of everything that I want to talk about with you here today,
Yep.
before we get into all that, I want to find out about Paul Hynek. I want to know Paul more. Tell us more about yourself and what you have going on and everything that you're into these days.
Okay, I'm joined by my boss here that you may be able to see, my UFO kitty. So what should I say? I'm one of 5 kids of my parents. And people tend to think of my father as a UFO guy, but he's really a scientist. So we grew up in a scientific academic household with a healthy heaping of UFOs. I don't know life without UFOs, and just always had an interest and appreciation for the kind of edges of accepted science.
Yeah, no, that's great. And when it comes to that now, are you kind of still, investigating that in an official capacity? Or is that kind of like something that you're just interested in on the side?
Yeah, my career is a little bit odd. The dividing line between my work and hobbies is kind of blurry at times. I am now with my brother Joel working on adding to my father's classification system of close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, because that speaks really well to the type of encounter, but it doesn't yet get into the type and strength of evidence. So that's something that we would like to add to that classification system.
Really interesting. I actually want to touch on that in a little bit, but just kind of starting from the beginning a little bit, you mentioned what the household was like when you were growing up. Can you kind of expound on that a little bit? Were you able to grasp kind of the gravity of what was happening around you, of what your father was investigating and working on for the U.S. government?
Well, I think however you grow up, good or bad, is normal to you at the time. And it's in hindsight that you look back and you say, oh, this was extra interesting, or that sucked, or whatever. It just seemed normal. I just don't, it was something that happened all the time. None of us children really needed to lean into the phenomena. I guess I did probably more than the others. There were kind of 2 generations. There were 3 kids, a gap of 12 years, then my little brother and me. And the early generation is more Project Blue Book. And the second generation, my brother and I, were more Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the movie. And I would go with my father to investigate sightings and to various conferences, and just thought it was fascinating. I don't know how you can look at this phenomena, no matter what you think of the evidence, and not find it fascinating, right?
Absolutely. And for myself, I can speak to that. I got the bug probably around 20 years old. I was actually always kind of hesitant to get into it. It kind of, quite frankly, it freaked me out a lot growing up.
And what corrupted you? What took you over to the dark side?
I think it was 2 things, actually. And, both of these subjects, I guess, are kind of debated a lot, but you have the ancient Egypt side of things. I always found that interesting. And that kind of connected to me with Edgar Cayce. So I watched a lot of documentaries concerning both of those things, and that piqued my interest. And then the Philadelphia experiment really piqued my interest. And I'm like, what the heck is going on there? They teleported a battleship and there's aliens involved. So I was around like 20 years old when I started kind of looking into those things. And well, now here we are 3 years on UAP, and it's been a wild ride.
Well, it's interesting. I think in this field, there are 2 kinds of people. There are those who feel they've had a personal experience with some kind of alien intelligence and maybe repeated, and those who haven't, but are just really interested in the phenomena. I think both you and I are in that latter camp, and it makes us somewhat flexible We just want to find out what the truth is. Let the chips fall where they may. Extraterrestrial, interdimensional. I don't have a horse in the race. I lean towards various things that seem more likely, but it just feels like it's going to be a while before we uncover what we eventually feel to be the ultimate truth or truths of what could be a multi-layered phenomena.
I think it's a really good way to put it. And actually, kind of on that note, was there something, maybe that you came across while you were at a conference with your father, or just in anything during your father's time? Was there something that you remember that kind of sticks out in your mind where you're like, if you had to say to somebody, if they said, Paul, how could you think this stuff is real? What story would you give them to say, well, I saw this or I heard this. This is why, I look into it so much.
Well, I think I would first set the stage with a quote that's often attributed to Richard Feynman, that there are two kinds of people in the world: those who are okay with questions they cannot answer, and those who are not okay with their answers being questioned. A lot of people, when looking at the UFO phenomena or any other, say, supernatural or odd phenomena, find it intellectually uncomfortable to accept that there is sufficient evidence to merit further study or to demonstrate that there is a phenomena if they don't have a ready-made answer. So an example would be, I know the U.S. Navy has said we see lots of objects in the sky and in the water, and we're concerned about the safety of our aviators, but I don't know how they get here. And they just stop because they don't have an answer. We are pattern-seeking mammals. And without a pattern, it's very uncomfortable to say, yes, I believe in this, or I accept the weight of the data to suggest a phenomena, but I don't have an answer. So for me, it's not so much this or that case, but it's more government pronouncements. Like Roswell, the base commander said, we captured a flying saucer. I think that the personnel on staff at the time was sufficiently advanced to tell the difference between rubber, duct tape, and balsa wood from something presumably of meta-terrestrial origin. The Navy, as I mentioned, has said they see lots of crafts. These, to me, are more compelling than any single or group of eyewitness cases. It's sort of the background information that distills all of these cases into these pronouncements. The report that came out in 2022, it said twice that this is from the alphabet soup of all these government agencies, from the intelligence community, that they view UAP, as they like to call them, as a significant threat. And I don't think they would say that without any cause. So to me, it's mostly reading between the lines or official government pronouncements, whether or not they meant to cause any particular reaction, that carry the most weight for me.
It's interesting. I wonder, kind of going back, you mentioned Roswell, and that made me think of something when it comes to, fellow scientists, namely Oppenheimer and Einstein. And I'm wondering if there's any truth to the rumors that Oppenheimer and Einstein both were called into Roswell to help understand what was going on. Have you ever heard that before? Is there truth to that?
I have not, so I don't know anything about it at all. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it comes from, gosh, her name escapes me. I actually did an entire episode about her, and her name escapes me. But she was a professor in her older age and everything, and she says, and she never changed her story, that she was Einstein's assistant, and she was there at Roswell with Oppenheimer and Einstein, and she saw all of these, smaller, not tiny, but smaller gray aliens that they talk about, 4 feet and everything like that. And it's just something that's always intrigued me. And I just wondered, I thought I would throw that out there, given your scientific background with you and your father, if that was something that ever came up.
Yeah, no, it didn't. I'd be intrigued to learn more, but yeah, I've not heard that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll try to find a name after we're done here. I'll go back in my episodes and I'll find her name. I'll email it to you if you'd like to look into it more. But her
Okay,
name just
and I just asked Chat GPT, and it's not aware of that. So,
oh,
yeah, but yeah, who knows?
Not even Chat GPT knows. Okay, well, we'll look into this one a little bit more.
Yeah.
Outside of that, though, and I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts on this, and maybe even what if the discussion ever came up between you and your father, and if he got blowback on this end, the religious aspect of things. It's always something that I come back to personally when I think about the Vatican and what type of role they might play when it comes to disclosure and what they've known over the centuries and things of that nature. Do you feel like religion, and not even so much just Christianity, but religion in general, might play a barrier of some sort to people accepting what's kind of going on, and even to the government disclosing what's going
on? Yeah, well, established religious frameworks don't really have a place for aliens. That said, the Catholic Church has put out an ecumenical stating, well, at an ecumenical conference, has stated that they believe there is life elsewhere in the universe. So I think they don't want to get caught flat-footed as they have multiple times in the past.
Right.
You know, there have been numerous what we call cults that were doomsday cults that predicted the end of the universe or end of the world on a certain date. And yet when that end didn't happen, largely those cults don't go away. So even if you believe that aliens are inconsistent with your religious beliefs, and then you start to believe in or accept the weight of the evidence for aliens, it doesn't mean you're going to say, hey, my religious beliefs need to be changed or scrapped because of this new evidence. I think people would largely become fortified in their religious beliefs because that's what gives them comfort.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. It's something that I just see pop up here and there, and it's just always kind of sticks in my mind. You know, what type of role does that play? And so,
yeah, and you know, people don't typically adopt religious beliefs because of what we would call evidence. They adopt them because they were brought up in that religion, or they feel they've had a personal experience, and so that's not, in their mind, inconsistent with any kind of discovery about aliens, I don't think.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good point. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here because I actually watched the show Project Blue Book that History Channel did. And I forget the actor's name, but it was the actor who played Littlefinger in Game of Thrones, played your father, Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Did you have any consulting when it came to that on the History Channel? Did they come to you and say, hey, you know, we want to find out more about this? Was that largely fictional? You know, I mean, was it dramatized, or was it based off of a lot of things that really happened?
So first, for the record, that very fine actor's name is Aidan Gillen.
Thank you.
Who played my TV father. And he's fantastic. And yes, both my brother Joel and I were consultants on the show. And typically when you're a consultant on a movie or TV show, you're in the background and they just call you when they have a question. But because both my brother and I have significant experience in Hollywood, I asked that we be given the pre-production scripts and that I could go to the set. And they said, sure. So I went to the set multiple times, watched filming, and both my brother and I read all of the scripts that were pre-production, meaning that you could still make changes before they were finalized, and gave significant input along the way.
Oh, okay, that's good. So, I mean, were you guys happy with the way those turned out when it was, when, you know, when the seasons came out and all?
Yeah, you know, to your other question, the show is not strictly accurate, but the show is meant to be authentic. That it captures the overall essence of the characters of my parents. And TV mom, Laura Minnell, was also an excellent choice. And sort of captures the overall flavor of the times of this Cold War paranoia and espionage and increasing number of very credible cases. And so I think the show did a really good job for what it wanted to do.
Yeah, it was great. I always enjoyed it. So good job. To throw that out there. So, but going back to kind of that time period for your father, he started out as a skeptic. A lot of people know that, but kind of ended up where, figured, hey, there's really something going on here. Really couldn't deny it anymore. Was it a collection of things that led to that conclusion for him? Or was there one specific thing that made him say, wow, okay, there's really something going on that I can't explain?
Yeah. It was more the accumulated weight of the data that allowed for him to see patterns of the data of highly credible Air Force pilots who have good vision, who respond well under pressure, who are trained to spot things in the sky, and other credible witnesses seeing similar type things. And indeed, sometimes a pilot would see something here and it could be picked up on radar over there, establishing a flight path, etc. That really made him feel that this is just something that I can't continue to debunk. So he became not a believer, because scientists don't believe in data, but an acceptor of the accumulated weight of the data.
Hmm. And I think that's where a lot of people land nowadays too. It's, even people who would say maybe 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, where they would say, I'm not sure about this, all this UFO stuff that I see on the news. And then you have David Grush in front of Congress, and you start to hear more about these things, speaking about, pilots reporting sightings, Ryan Graves being one of them. He was on in front of Congress as well with David Grush. So it kind of feels like what your father went through is almost what the, collective consciousness is going through these days, where you have a lot of people starting to say, man, I really can't, understand or explain away some of this stuff anymore.
Yeah, I think he traced a narrative arc that many others have done. And I think he helped a lot of people because he's a pretty by the books astrophysicist who was pretty honest about what he felt, given the sometimes muzzles of the Air Force. And I think people felt he was a credible expert in the field who over time became more and more outspoken that something is happening here and we should take a look into it. And I think that helped a lot of people hop on the train and go for the ride.
No, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I want to get back to the Hollywood thing a little bit, but I have to ask, and maybe this is out of line, and if it is, you can tell me, because I don't want to, have you speak, badly behind anybody's back or anything like that. But I want to get your opinion. You talk about astrophysicists and scientists in this subject. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a name that comes to mind that some people kind of look at and say, like, how do you deny what's going on here? I mean, have you followed what he has said in the past and everything when it comes to this topic?
Yeah. So my brother Joel knows Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I'm friends with Michael Shermer, who is the editor and founder of Skeptic Magazine, and Seth Shostak, who is the lead astronomer of SETI. I think those are the three best known critical voices or skeptics about UFOs. I think Neil is perhaps the most dismissive of the three, but I feel they're all intellectually honest. And indeed, I've debated with Michael Shermer. I've had Seth Shostak on panels with me. And, the thing is that people who are passionate about UFOs can't understand how somebody would not believe it. But I don't feel that way. I think a reasonable person can look at the phenomena and come to the conclusion that there's nothing there. It's not a slam dunk that aliens are here or visited us, are they from another dimension or extraterrestrial. And the evidence that's accrued can be interpreted in a way to not come to the conclusion that there's a real phenomenon. It's just not that cut and dry. And the classification system that I'm developing with my brother is designed to address that, because for whatever reason, most of mainstream science just has poo-pooed the evidence for UFOs.
Mm.
And so what I'd like to do is help inculcate in experiencer communities, and not just UFOs, a more proactive approach to gathering evidence that is science friendly, that's unambiguous and verifiable. I really don't care what the US government says or does. They're a bad faith, corrupt central actor. But I think we can make progress by having better, more fruitful interactions between experiencers and mainstream science, like Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if there's a way where everybody can kind of come together, because I think that kind of hurts, the discussion. And it's funny because I think a lot of people want the same thing. They're just trying to find answers, right? That's what I do. That's what you do,
Right.
and on different scale. And
yeah, and scientists are cautious because science needs to have replication and verification. And without that, that's the scientific method. Without that, they're just going to be hesitant to say, hey, there's something going on here. So, a lot of people think that scientists are, they erect this Spartan intellectual shield wall of dogma against any kind of heresy of beliefs or theories that are outside the mainstream. I think it's much more prosaic. Most scientists are busy. If you have an astrophysicist who focused on, red dwarfs, they're not even that comfortable speaking about black holes because that's not their specialty. And they may hear about all these theories of ancient archaeology or aliens, but they don't know which ones are the most credible. They don't have time. They're teaching, they're publishing, they have a family, they're on the lecture circuit, they're applying for a grant. There's not a lot in it for them to assess these claims to the extent that would make them comfortable that there's something going on. It's just they have other interests and they're just leading busy lives. So I don't begrudge any of these scientists for not coming down and saying, yes, this is a real phenomena, because again, I think you can honestly look at this evidence and not be convinced.
Interesting. Well, someone who sounds convinced anyway from a paper that just came out, if you're familiar with it, was Dr. Michael Masters from Harvard, paleontologist, and seems like a pretty brilliant man, has come out with this report that really has kind of caught the mainstream over the past couple of days, that it's possible that aliens, extraterrestrials, or interdimensional beings, he kind of left the gray area there on however you want to refer to them, but have been living on Earth and have been here and maybe, are in mountains and volcanoes and underground. Really a lot of the theories that, lay people have put out before. But now you have this Harvard professor got insane. What do you make of that? Is that just in a case of somebody who decided to dedicate their time to it, and this is the conclusion that they came to?
So Mike is a friend of mine, and
okay.
In a presentation I gave at Contact in the Desert a couple weeks ago, with his kind permission, I used some of his slides in a presentation I gave because I think he is the leading authority on the theory that perhaps some or all aliens that we encounter are actually our own species from the future. And, once you start to unravel the UFO phenomena, you quickly get past the point of thinking something is just way too out there. And time travel seems to be ridiculous to many people at first, but he is a very smart guy, and he's put together a good case for why that may be at least part of the phenomenon.
It's one of the questions, right? I mean, it's one of the big questions that people pose, and it's extremely fascinating, which is why I like talking about it. I like to bring it up. And actually, I reached out to Dr. Masters recently, and we're hoping to connect sometime mid to late July. So hopefully about a month he'll come on here and I'll be able to talk to him, which I look forward to.
He'd be a great guest. He's very articulate and he's got a really good case that he makes.
It's fantastic. I look forward to it. And well, you know, a lot of people, don't you, Paul? Everybody mentioned it's like, you had dinner with him last night, so that's great.
Well, it's not really that large of a field. So if you spend a fair amount of time at conferences, et cetera, you start to hang around all these folks. Yeah.
You come across him. Getting back a little bit to the Hollywood portion, because I do want to ask about the Close Encounters. You know, what that was like, kind of making the movie, what that was like for you, for your father, kind of interacting, giving the input to Steven Spielberg, and kind of connected to what you're doing now. So going back to that, what was that process like? Because we actually did see a cameo of him toward the end of the movie, right? I don't think a lot of people know that.
Yeah. Yeah. So Spielberg and the production company bought the rights to the title Close Encounters of the Third Kind from my father and his publisher. And yeah, he was the technical advisor for the movie and had a cameo role. And in a curious twist, in one episode of the TV show Project Blue Book, they focused on the movie Close Encounters. And I was there that day on the set. And at the end of that episode, as my TV mom and dad are walking to the camera pulls back and shows a cameraman in a crane being lifted in the air. And that was me. So I had a cameo role as a consultant in the TV show about my father, in the episode about the movie in which he was the technical advisor and had a cameo role. And then that night, I went out drinking with Aidan Gillen until 7 a.m.
Fantastic. Now that's a story. That sounds like there's a little bit of almost like in Seinfeld, yada yada yada. We drank until 7 a.m. I feel like there's a little bit in between there. Maybe we could touch on another time, but it sounds like you had a lot of fun. That's cool. It's like a full circle moment.
Yeah, it was very meta.
Right. Very cool. That's funny though. So, but kind of connecting to your work now, right? You and your brother kind of adding to this scale, right, of Close Encounters. So what does that look like? What type of work are you doing on that, where, you know, basically how will that end up and what will the new definitions be?
Yeah, so it's still a work in progress. One of the objectives is to demonstrate or help experiencers, if they so choose, to demonstrate the objective reality of the intelligences they claim to communicate with. And so to do that, we need to be able to present, as I mentioned, unambiguous and verifiable evidence. So what we're doing is categorizing by type and strength the nature of the evidence, such that experiencers, to the extent they can influence, likely not control these interactions, can try to obtain this type of evidence as opposed to the random bits and things that we've received that have not moved the needle for leading scientists.
Interesting. So what do you feel like the end game is? Is it just kind of bring clarification on some of these things that we don't have clarification on?
Well, put it this way. You mentioned Neil deGrasse Tyson. What if Neil deGrasse Tyson went on CNN and said, you know what? I've seen evidence that convinces me that aliens are here. Imagine the tectonic shift that would make. Or Michael Shermer, Seth Shostak, and others, if they came out and said, I have done a 180, I now accept that the UFO phenomena is very real. That would have an unbelievable impact on society. And note, there's no government involvement necessary for that. So that's what the end game is to collect and present science-friendly evidence to scientists who would then publicly say, there's compelling evidence here. Now what?
That's great. I think it's brilliant, really, because you're taking it to a different perspective. You want to bring the scientist perspective to have scientist evidence, right? So I think that's
Well, it's just the government has proven to be a bad faith actor. A lot of people don't believe them, but people still believe scientists. These scientists that we mentioned, they're very credible. And if
yes.
we have them and others, scientists, who say, I've observed the evidence and I find it compelling, that would constitute what I call exposure, which is far more effective, I believe, than disclosure.
Really interesting. Well, I look forward to hearing more about that as you continue your work on it. That's really fascinating. Actually, I never heard of that. But talking about the government, I'm curious. Do you see parallels at all between how people viewed Project Blue Book to how people view currently now Arrow, AARO? Are there parallels there at all? Because you're just talking about with those two things. Just if
Yeah.
we put them, in a nutshell, side by side, we're talking about government programs that were, created to
Mhm.
investigate the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't really know. I don't really monitor how people feel about the government agencies. To me, it's not the purpose of government to disclose this information. And even though, people like Danny Sheehan, another friend of mine who's an amazing man, along with Chris Mellon and others, are applying great pressure in new ways to force governmental disclosure. And we'll see on October 18th how fruitful this latest wave of efforts will prove to be. But I just don't care about what they say or do. And so I'm just much more focused on science and scientists as opposed to government and government bureaucrats.
Well, on that note, then, I mean, do you think it's a waste of time? Like, when it comes to politicians, like, Marco Rubio or Tim Burchett or Jared Moskowitz, some of these people, Senator Gillibrand, who publicly push for disclosure, or Chuck Schumer, who was trying to get that act through the NDAA. I mean, is it a waste of time? Is it fruitless because there's just so much bureaucracy that's just going to block it anyway?
It's not a waste of time, and it may well produce monumental results. It's just not something I'm personally interested in or going to devote much time to. I mean, I spoke at a fundraiser for Danny Sheehan's new nonprofit 2 weeks ago, and I believe very much in what he's doing and will help him. But for me, my efforts are, I think, best allocated to an end around approach that is not dependent on what the government deigns to release to us.
Well, I think that's a smart way to go about it because, we've what disclosure in my over the past years really been very successful. So
Yeah.
I think you're taking the correct route there, Paul.
Well, there's enough super smart people, including Steve Bassett, Richard Dolan, and others, who are all working on disclosure. I don't think I have much value to add to that. So I may be able to help going a different direction.
Well, I think it's great because then at that point, I mean, you mentioned those are great names that are working on one side, and then you and your team are working on another side. And I think it is worth, for the record, I do think it is worth, the work that we see. Like you said, the Richard Dolans and Stephen Bassett's of the world, and Danny Sheehan, who I met once. I had the privilege of meeting him one time. He's brilliant.
Yeah, he is.
They're doing great work, right? On the backside, Chris Mellon, Lou Elizondo, all these people are doing fantastic work. And I hope it's fruitful. But I think it's important that what you're doing as well, so you kind of team up on both sides. And I think that's the best way to go about it.
Yeah. You never know. The U.S. government hasn't been caught in the crosshairs of Danny Sheehan before like this. So it might work. And I certainly hope it does. But while he's working on that, I'll go on the other fringes of science and try to produce some fruit there.
That's fantastic. I got to ask you, and if you haven't heard too much about it, that's fine. But we mentioned Danny Sheehan. He's been quoted recently as talking about disclosure in a timeline. he's been quoted as talking about October being some type of disclosure event, sometime late
Yeah.
October. And the only reason I bring this up is because in some of the people that I talk to, there's a couple of people that I talk to personally in military intelligence analysts who have spoken to me, and I've heard the same information from them before Danny Sheehan said it. So when Danny Sheehan said it, I was like, oh, shoot, there might be something to this.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have a read on that? Because I think it's kind of interesting.
Well, the most recent law that Danny helped draft and get passed forces all agencies of the federal government to release any information they have on or before October 18th.
18th, right? Okay.
So I call that disclosure day. So we'll see. And hopefully on October 19th, we'll all be happy fellows. But I don't know. It's just, I don't know what secrets the government has, and I don't know what secrets they will actually disclose.
Right. That you're right. That's the ultimate question. Maybe on October 19th or October 20th, you and I and Danny Sheehan can have a huge conversation together. We can all get together and talk about it here.
Yeah. And, just like if someone feels that aliens are extraterrestrial in origin, then it's probably likely that that planet, that civilization across the universe is not sending their A team all the way here, or that there are some kind of AI sentient bots. Right. But it's also likely that if aliens are here and are manipulating us or pulling the strings of various organs of various governments, that the decision to disclose information may not rest with our human governments. It could be controlled by the same aliens who have come here and seem to have incredible technology and sway over us.
Yes. It's such a good point, and it's not a point that I think is brought up enough, right? Because we talk about the human side of things, right? We talk about the government, the bureaucracy, even when it comes to religion, but there is that factor, and it might really be a factor.
Yep.
Interesting. On that note, though, I do wonder, who do you think, because again, all these different factors that we've talked about, who do you think has the most to lose from disclosure, and whatever disclosure might look like, right? Whatever that might mean when it comes to, okay, alien life exists. Maybe it's just a 3 basic truths that David Grush talks about. We have materials, we have biologics, and they're real. So maybe even if it's just that, who do you think has the most to lose?
I don't know. If, let's say, whatever happens, it's on October 18th or something else, there's a flying saucer that lands on the lawn of the White House, it's really hard to know how the threads of national security will be torn apart, or if this or that religion will go away or double down, or if a government is toppled, or people are angry that it didn't disclose the information before, or are paranoid about the new alien presence that might still be here. I really don't know who has the most to lose in that scenario, because I think it could be, even though a unbelievably significant, one of the most significant events of history, I don't know exactly how it would unfold and who it might impact the most. And I think also we might not know the impacts for quite some years because we'd just be in a period of global shock for some amount of time, I imagine.
It's interesting. And it's just one of those questions, right? And maybe that's one of those questions that's asked behind the scenes.
Well, it's also one of those questions that I'm comfortable not being able to answer.
And that's totally fine. Hey, I mean, we will take speculation here as well. That's completely fine. Before we wrap up here, though, this has been fantastic. Thank you, Paul Hynek, for joining the show. And I really enjoyed this conversation. What does your gut tell you? Everything that you've gone through, and I know, you deal with data and everything on that kind of realm. But if you search deep down, everything that you've gone through throughout your life and everything that you've seen from your father, what does your gut tell you about the UAP phenomenon?
Interdimensional.
Interesting. So interdimensional how? So what would that mean for people who can't wrap their head around that when it comes to interdimensional beings?
Well, I find, and Jacques Vallée has said, if when the dust settles, the entirety of the UFO phenomena is extraterrestrial, he'll be bored. It certainly seems to many of us that extraterrestrial may be a part of it, but not the entirety of the phenomena. If we liken the size of the known universe to the continental US, we are less than a speck of dust in Kansas. And even though we've been beaming out episodes of I Love Lucy, et cetera, for many decades, it's non-trivial for somebody to find us. It's a very, very big universe. So how do they find us? And if they come, whether they are biological beings or AI sentinels, why aren't they more overt in their contact with us? Okay, they may be manipulating us. I don't know. But I have problems with how they would find us and why they would care. So for me, interdimensional answers those questions much better, that they may be related to us in some way and adjacent to us, such that with their technology coming into our dimension and going back to theirs may be a fairly trivial endeavor.
So if they're interdimensional, and again, this is all hypothetical, are they human? I mean, are we talking about, I know we kind of mentioned this theory earlier when it comes to time traveling. Is it, mixed together, time traveling and interdimensional? Or are we just talking about beings that our minds can't conceive because we can't conceive all the different dimensions?
Hell if I know.
These are the questions, right?
Yeah. I mean, I have been pursuing what I think is a potential route to interdimensional communication. And it's fascinating, but I don't presume to have those kind of $64,000 answers.
What would interdimensional communication look like? What is it as far as, what you're researching there? How would that go about?
So I was having lunch 7 or 8 years ago with a friend of mine who incidentally crash landed tardigrades on the moon, who asked me where my father thought UFOs may come from. And I said, well, he didn't know, but he felt extraterrestrial certainly didn't seem to explain everything, and that there may be some interdimensional components. And he said, well, you should read a book called Alien Information Theory. I said, Alien Information Theory, that's a pretty cool book. Of course, what's it about? And he said, well, it's about DMT. And I said, what's DMT? And he said, it's the most powerful psychedelic substance known. And one of the better known variants is ayahuasca. I said, really? Okay. And so a couple hours later that day, I met a new friend, and he was talking about what he does. And he mentioned he does DMT facilitations. I'm like, wow. So long story short, purely in the interest of science, I took one for the team and started experiencing DMT. And the premise of the book, Alien Information Theory, is that it's not a hallucinogenic drug, but that it's a interdimensional technology. And, this may sound wackadoodle, but we're talking about UFOs. So we're already past the point of garden variety science. And so I'm fascinated by the potential, which might be the biggest Hail Mary of all time, that the experiences one feels they have while taking DMT might actually be real. And if they are, it's fascinating to me, because I can't do a CE5 and summon a flying saucer. I just can't. But I can create a situation and partake in DMT and have an experience that may be another dimension. And I once asked the intelligence that I felt that I encountered if they were related to what we perceive as UFOs and aliens. And the answer I got was that they couldn't explain in a way that I could understand. And I thought, well, look, if DMT machine elves, as Terrence McKenna calls them, are actually related to aliens that we see, yeah, I can understand how I wouldn't understand that connective tissue. So to me, it's been a fascinating area of research that is very different from what my friends are doing for disclosure. And, like I said, is a Hail Mary, but it's something I think is actually important and fascinating.
That's exactly the word I was about to use, is fascinating, just completely fascinating. That's truly something. So as we wrap up here today, thank you again for so much time for doing this. How do you see this all playing out? Let's imagine. I know we mentioned October and all the things that everybody's trying to do behind the scenes. Let's fast forward to, I don't know, January 1st, 2026. So a year and a half from now. Where do you think we are? How do you see this all playing out? Maybe just in the next year and a half.
Don't really know, but I'm as skeptical as Neil deGrasse Tyson is of UFOs. I'm probably every bit as skeptical about meaningful government disclosure. So I would not be surprised one bit if we're in more or less the same boat we are now, and that we've had more whistleblowers come forward, and there's no great shift in overall public beliefs.
I hate to say it, but I kind of lean that way as well. But I guess only time will tell. We're just going to keep doing the best that we can and ask the questions and just go from there. Before we go, Paul, how can people follow what you're doing? I know you've written a few books and everything like that. So you're a part of the Hollywood Disclosure Alliance. So how can people follow what you're doing to kind of keep up with your work?
Well, I've got a very anemic social media footprint, but I'm on Twitter at Paul Hynek. That's probably the only place you can see the relatively few things I do online.
How about the books? I mean, I know those must be totally fascinating as well. How can people find those?
So yeah, there's a book credited to me, but it's largely written by my co-author about propulsion systems for UFOs.
Oh, cool.
But apart from that, I've got some articles here and there, but nothing really of note, I would say.
All right, fair enough. Well, I think you're being modest personally, but that's just me. Well, you do great work, Paul. Thank you so much for coming on UAP today, for having this discussion. I think it was great. I really enjoyed it, and I think the listeners, the audience will enjoy it as well, because it's really insightful. So hopefully we can have you back on. We can keep in touch and maybe do this again down the road.
Sounds good.
Thanks a lot. Paul Hynek here today on UAP, the Unidentified Alien Podcast.